Hello, how you doing? We are going to look at the anatomy of the spinal cord, but in this case we're going to look at the blood supply of the spinal cord. Why is that so important? Okay, I mean, I've never really looked at it that way. I mean, I know there are some spinal arteries, I know where they come from. It's like, yeah, job done, right? There's more to it than that, and when you delve deeply, you find that the terminology is a little bit of a mess, and it gets used differently by different people and different books and what have you. So I'm going to try and simplify the whole arrangement and explain some of those terms. By the end of this, you should understand where the blood supply to the spinal cord comes from. Why is it so important? Well, these are cells within the spinal cord, very, very long cells, and they need a rich blood supply just like cells elsewhere in the body. And if those blood vessels pass into the spinal cord, it's quite important, we like our spinal cords, if those blood vessels get blocked, those cells in the spinal cord can become ischemic and die, which would be a bad thing, right? Now bear with me, but if we're going to do this properly, I need to introduce some other arteries in the body outside the spinal cord, outside the vertebral column first, for this to make sense. And if we're going to do it, if we do it properly, it will make sense and we will understand it. If we do it in a mishmash, disorganized way, it won't make sense. Okay, all right, we've got these beautiful arteries up here. These are, not that one, out of the way there, but we see the vertebral arteries running up in the cervical vertebrae. So the transverse processes of the cervical vertebrae sticking out laterally, they've actually got a hole in each one. That's how we know. If we just have an individual bone and we pick it up and we look at it and we see a hole in the transverse process, we know it's from the cervical region because that hole is for the vertebral artery to run through on either side. The vertebral artery comes from the subclavian artery, which is going out to the upper limb, right? So it runs posteriorly with the cervical vertebrae and then goes through foramen magnum into the cranial cavity. And the left and right vertebral arteries come together and form a single midline basilar artery. These are two blood vessels, as in the vertebral arteries, these are two blood vessels that supply blood to the brain. So they're really important. I've covered them elsewhere. They're pretty great. I mean, that's beautiful. Look, isn't it? It's beautiful when we dissect it too. Okay, so the vertebral arteries, and then as we descend, look, inside the thorax, so this is the aorta, massive blood vessel, major blood vessel of the body. As we descend, we see lots of posterior intercostal arteries branching, and they're going to run around the body wall. But this bulge here, these are the vertebrae. So these posterior intercostal arteries are going past the vertebrae as they go off around the body wall. So we'll use those later as well, vertebral arteries, intercostal arteries. And then when we go past the diaphragm, oh, I can take that out. As we go past the diaphragm, we see a continuation of this segmentation pattern, as in we see lumbar arteries running from the aorta around posteriorly, also running past the vertebrae. And then if we get down into the pelvis, we see things like this. We see this median sacral artery, and there are lateral sacral arteries as well. The lateral sacral arteries come from the internal iliac arteries. You can kind of pretty much see that the median sacral artery is a branch of the aorta. So those sacral arteries are going to the sacral region. The sacrum, again, that's part of the vertebrae, right? And in fact, if we go up into the neck, this isn't something I can see on any of these models, but we have ascending and deep cervical arteries, which are coming essentially from branches from the subclavian artery, again, from the thyrocervical trunk and the something else. But the point is that there are a number of arteries outside the vertebral column as we descend. Okay, look at this. these are transparent vertebrae. Inside there in yellow, you can see the spinal cord. These guys here coming out, these are the spinal nerves leaving the spinal cord and disappearing off around the body. And you can see in red, you can see the vertebral arteries running within the cervical vertebrae. Very, very neat, tidy, messy. Okay, face. Inside the cranial cavity. Now there's that basilar artery again there. And you can see on either side the two vertebral arteries coming together to form it. Now look there. That down there is the spinal cord. And that there is a blood vessel that's going to go and run with the spinal cord. That is the anterior spinal artery. So the anterior spinal artery is formed by two branches, one from each vertebral artery coming together in the midline anteriorly and forming the anterior spinal artery. And that will run the entire length of the spinal cord. Look, so whoop, anterior, posterior. So it's on the anterior side, right? Spinal cord, there's the dorsal root ganglion. So this is dorsal or posterior. This is anterior or ventral. So watch out for those words being used interchangeably by me and other people and other sources. So we said we had the anterior spinal artery, and this is anterior or ventral. So the anterior spinal artery is running the length of the spinal cord in this anterior median fissure. That's what this groove is called here, right? Now, interestingly, the anterior spinal artery is going to supply blood to the anterior part of the spinal cord and the lateral parts. And actually, the anterior spinal artery is going to do most of the work. It's going to supply blood to about 2/3 of the spinal cord. Remember, the grey matter, cell bodies. White matter, myelinated axons. So we have tracts running up and down between the brain and other parts of the body, and we have connections here. All of these things need to be supplied with blood. Now, you know the rule. If there's an anterior spinal artery, there must be a posterior spinal artery. In fact, there are two. We can't really see them on here, but you see the anterior spinal artery, but the posterior spinal arteries are on the posterior spinal cord. So far, so good. Now you see, okay, so back here, we would have the cerebellum. The cerebellum has a bunch of arteries called the cerebellar arteries. And the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, it gets abbreviated to PICA, but I don't like abbreviations. The posterior inferior cerebellar artery, there's one on either side, gives off the posterior spinal artery in most people. And it kind of runs posteriorly. You can see how that runs around the spinal cord. In some people, the posterior spinal arteries come directly from the vertebral arteries. But remember, look, you can see how the posterior inferior cerebellar artery is in fact itself a branch of the vertebral artery. Anyway, one way or another, the posterior spinal arteries form and they run down the full length of the spinal cord on its posterior surface. Now where? They run on the posterior spinal cord. Remember, dorsal root ganglions, this is dorsal or posterior. And they run in this posterolateral sulcus. So they run in this posterolateral sulcus, one on either side, right next to where the dorsal roots go into the spinal cord. This is a long way. And the posterior the posterior spinal arteries then, they're supplying blood to this posterior part of the spinal cord. So the anterior spinal artery does most of the work, and the posterior spinal arteries supply blood to the posterior parts of the spinal cord. So from these arteries, many small branches come and spread around and supply blood to the regions of the spinal cord. Are you already starting to think, ooh, what does this part of the spinal cord do? What does this part of the spinal cord do? What does this... Because that's the crux of it. The spinal cord is also surrounded by the same connective tissue layers as the brain. It's a continuous thing. So the spinal cord is covered by pia mater, and then there's a space called the subarachnoid space, and then we have the arachnoid mater, which is stuck to the dura mater, the tough covering. So these spinal arteries are running in the subarachnoid space, just like the cerebral arteries are, right? And the pia mater is actually very, very well vascularized. There are lots of small branches running around there. So that's it, right? We've got anterior and posterior spinal arteries, and they supply blood to the spinal cord. I wish. Well, you see, the problem is with the length. Having these very, very long arteries only receiving blood from the vertebral arteries up here isn't going to work very well and doesn't work very well. So do you remember those arteries that we saw around the vertebral column? We saw the cervical arteries, we saw the posterior intercostal arteries, we saw the lumbar arteries, and we saw the sacral arteries. Well, these arteries, we saw that they went past the vertebrae. They give off radicular arteries, radicular branches. Radix means root in Latin. So the next step to think about this is that the arteries near the vertebral column give off radicular arteries that pass into the intervertebral foramen. That's the same gap that the spinal nerves are coming out of, and they meet up with the spinal arteries. So then we have this collateral blood flow, we have this anastomosis, these links between the vertebral arteries and the anterior and posterior spinal arteries, and the arteries outside supplying blood by the radicular arteries, which also get described as feeder arteries. Well, that's the simplest description, but it's not the full description. This is unfortunately where it starts to get a little ugly. Okay, we've got our posterior intercostal arteries. Segmental spinal arteries branch from the posterior intercostal arteries, and I think probably every level give off radicular arteries that pass in through the intervertebral foramen and run with the ventral and dorsal roots of the spinal nerves, and they supply blood to the ventral and dorsal roots, which is why I think they're at every level. Those are the strict, I think that's the strict definition of the radicular arteries. But the radicular artery, that term gets used for lots of blood vessels doing lots of things in this region, so watch out for confusion. And these radicular arteries, we consider that's their job, is to supply these roots with blood. If those radicular arteries pass all the way to the spinal arteries, they get called radiculospinal arteries. All right. Now, so the other probably important idea here are segmental medullary arteries. Not at every level. I think it'll probably be about 8 to 10 levels. So, you know, on the left and right sides, it's not even symmetrical. But at a number of levels along the length of the spinal cord, we see segmental medullary arteries branching from the segmental spinal arteries that have branched from these other arteries that we were talking about: intercostal, cervical, lumbar, sacral. Those segmental medullary arteries offer significant contributions of blood flow to the anterior and posterior spinal arteries. So they're important. The most significant example of this and this blood vessel might come up when you're talking about the blood supply to the spinal cord, is the Artery of Adamkovic. It's probably how you pronounce it, something like that. I should have asked my Eastern European colleague first. And this also gets called the Great Radicular Artery of Adamkovic, or the Great Segmental Medullary Artery of Adamkovic, which is a great example of how all these terms get mixed up and muddled and used in different ways. But this is an artery that arises, and again, look, here's the variability, it arises from low thoracic levels or higher lumbar levels and supplies the anterior spinal artery with blood. It contributes to the anterior spinal artery usually. So if that artery is blocked, it has an effect on the spinal cord because of the reduced blood supply, demonstrating how important these segmental medullary arteries are to the blood supply of the spinal cord. It's not just the blood flow from the top, it's these segmental medullary arteries, or radicular arteries, if you like, contributing to the blood supply to the spinal cord that feeds all of the cells of the spinal cord with blood. Why is it so important? Well, up here in the neck, we have an enlarging. We have like the spinal cord gets bigger because we have the brachial plexus. We have lots of nerves to the upper limb, so there are more connections, so there's more grey matter, so the spinal cord is bigger. Down in the lumbar region, we have the lumbar plexus because we're sending off nerves to the lower limb, lots of nerves, lots of connections, so we're bigger. The lumbar spinal cord gets bigger, so it needs a bigger blood supply. If I'm going to teach this and spend 20-25 minutes teaching this, I would focus on those arteries near the vertebral column, vertebral arteries, deep cervical arteries, posterior intercostal arteries, lumbar arteries, sacral arteries. I'd make that point like we did. I'd describe how the anterior and posterior spinal arteries are branches of the vertebral arteries and how they run on the anterior spinal cord and on the posterior spinal cord, and they supply blood. The anterior spinal artery does most of the work, supplying blood to about 2/3 of the spinal cord, to the anterior-most parts and the lateral parts, and the posterior spinal arteries supply blood to the posterior part, and they are backed up by links, by blood vessels coming in to the spinal cord from outside the vertebral column, from those other blood vessels we were talking about, through radicular arteries. That's the word I'd remember. Or segmental medullary arteries. That's the other word I'd remember. And I might chuck in Adamkovic, the Artery of Adamkovic, just for fun to make that point. So if you got a little bit lost there, go back to that idea, okay? Yeah. So that is the blood supply to the spinal cord. Again, it is one of those things I tend to avoid, but I'm glad that I dove into it much more deeply to do this, and now I better understand it. And I know what it's like when you see all this terminology and it's getting, not misused, but it's getting blended with other terminology and it's not super clear. It puts you off. It makes it really hard to learn. I know because I'm still studying neuroanatomy and it does that to me. I have to work out what's going on, all right? So hopefully I broke it down for you. Right, and I also said at the beginning, why is this important? So these arteries are supplying blood to the cells of the spinal cord. So an occlusion, a blockage, like a blood clot to one of these blood vessels is going to limit blood flow to a region of the spinal cord, because we see there are lots of anastomoses, lots of links, lots of backup, lots of collateral circulation, but also lots of requirements for blood vessels to come in from the outside into the spinal cord. So there is a risk of ischemia, damage to the cells of the wherever I put it, damage to the cells of the spinal cord, and this is where you need to integrate your understanding of the tracts and the parts of the spinal cord to the blood supply. So if these cells are damaged, the corticospinal tract might be affected, the spinothalamic tract might be affected, those posterior spinal arteries are supplying blood to the dorsal columns, right? So you can imagine how different regions of the spinal cord could be affected differently by occlusion to blood vessels, of a blood vessel supplying blood to those regions. So a lot of those weird things we talk about, like Brown-Séquard sequence syndrome, having strange effects on the spinal cord, those can be caused by blockage of blood vessels. So you might see upper motor neuron deficits, upper motor neuron signs and symptoms. So weakness and paralysis of muscles, but also when you're testing reflexes, you'd see those signs that you would expect to see in an upper motor neuron lesion, right? And you'd also see loss of sensation, but maybe it's just a loss of what is the sensation that's being lost? Is it pain, temperature, fine touch, gross touch, proprioception? Because those are passing through different tracts in different regions of the spinal cord, so a different part might be affected. So if you can work out, if you can measure all those signs and symptoms and apply your knowledge of anatomy, you can work out what's going on. All right, we did it. The blood supply to the spinal cord. See you next week.